Los Angeles airport to Disneyland is a popular helicopter flight these days, with goggle-eyed, small fry among its passengers. A turbine-powered Sikorsky S-62 swings low around the famed amusement center.
In 1938, Congress passed the Civil Aeronautics Act, which created a new government agency responsible for non-military aviation, such as regulating fares and determining routes. The newly founded department was called the Civil Aeronautics Board. And by 1946, America began to experience a post-war boom with aviation and air transportation, leading the CAB to the task of administering federal aid to promote and develop the nation's civil airports. They were also in charge of administering the air-mail routes for private airlines that would transport mail from post offices. This leads to October 1st, 1947. The first regularly scheduled helicopter mail service was completed by Los Angeles Airways, or LAA, which became the first commercial helicopter airline with passenger service beginning on July 5th, 1951, making regular stops in the greater LA area and the Newport Beach Resort. Of all the fads that went through the 50s, no craze was crazier than that of the commuter helicopter.
The job will require a vertical lift machine, one able to fly directly between airport, midtown, and suburban communities. The helicopter is that machine. Flying under the regular air lanes and over surface traffic, scheduled helicopter airlines in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, as well as in Europe, have brought a new dimension to transportation.
Pretty soon we fly on to the year 1954. A lot was happening. Walt Disney had even made a deal with ABC to produce a TV show in exchange for a loan to build his not yet famed amusement center. The show was titled after the park, Disneyland. It aired at 7:30 on Wednesday nights, and February 9th, 1955, Walt gave an update.
So for a first-hand progress report, let's visit Disneyland now. We could go by car, of course. It's a pleasant 50-minute trip across town. But let's be different. Let's take to the air. Let's go by helicopter. Our point of departure is the studio front lawn. Although we're taking the flyways on this trip, in the future, you'll take the highways when you visit Disneyland.
A year prior to the opening, Walt began to take a few trips from the studio in Burbank to the construction site in Anaheim, via helicopter. Eventually, he began to consider this as a valid alternative to actually driving to Disneyland. In order to complete the park, Disneyland Incorporated needed to seek additional funds. One method for doing so was sponsorships. The Rocket to the Moon attraction in Tomorrowland was sponsored by TWA, Trans World Airlines. Advertised in 1955, trips from New York to Disneyland.
Flying by luxurious TWA, the official airline to Disneyland, and vacationing at the new Disneyland Hotel with pools and playgrounds just a step from your room.
To come through on that promise, the helicopter to Disneyland was born. For an additional $2, connections through TWA could be made at LAX, while Los Angeles Airways also operated with United and American Airlines. But in this brief 4 years since LAA began, passenger service had grown pretty rapidly. They now made stops in the San Fernando Valley, East LA, the San Gabriel Valley, Riverside, San Bernardino area, Long Beach, Orange County area, and of course, Disneyland. Initial service cost in 1955 was $4 each way. The helipad was a welcome addition to the park. It gave travel to VIPs and dignitaries like President John F. Kennedy, the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Mohammed Daud, the Prime Minister of India, and even the King of Belgium. The first helipad was located just outside the park next to the area that Tomorrowland occupies. This only lasted for 2 years as it was eventually moved 140 yards south in 1957. And again, it was moved just 3 years later in 1960 to the opposite side of the park, just north of the Disneyland Hotel. By this time, a one-way ticket had increased to $7, and the travel time had decreased to somewhere around 16 minutes. This is where the trouble started. Motel owners around Anaheim began to complain about the noise and possible danger their guests were in around the helicopter's flight path. The Anaheim City Council even went so far as to request LA Airways construct a full terminal with a waiting area and public restrooms. And while it varies over the 3 locations of the heliport, it's always a small ticketing area with minimal requirements met. And while LAA spent a fraction of the cost on most of their heliports in Van Nuys and Glendale, the Anaheim construction cost was somewhere around $32,000, with a $300 annual rental fee. This was all a hefty load for the still burgeoning helicopter airline. Initially, the airline used a helicopter called the Sikorsky S-55, which seated 12 passengers. By 1961, they had switched over to the Sikorsky S-61L, which seated 28 passengers, had a cruising altitude of 140 miles, and a price tag of $650,000. While 1956 held the date for the most commercial helicopter airlines with 107, by 1965 there was still around 46, which spread the government subsidies rather thin. However, 1965 was also the year where commercial helicopter manufacturing peaked. Attendance for helicopter passengers were around 30,000 per year, but by 1967 they had more than octupled, with somewhere around 306,000 passengers for that fiscal year. The lack of funds, coupled with the astronomical rise in the use of vehicles, led to where, and eventually, disaster. On May 22, 1968, Flight 841 returning from Disneyland to LAX came over the radio. LA, we're crashing, help us. Around 2,000 feet above Paramount, California, spectators began to see bags of mail being dropped from the aircraft to lighten the load. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough. A single bolt missing from the pitch change rod allowed the roto blades to separate, forcing the plane to crash. 3 crew members and 20 passengers lost their lives in one of the worst helicopter-related accidents in history. The tragedy was only met with more sorrow, as less than 6 months later on August 14, 1968, Flight 417 coming from LAX to Disneyland began to lose altitude due to metal fatigue in its roto blades. It crashed in Looters Park in Compton, California, killing its 3 crew members and 18 passengers. Among the passengers was a 13-year-old grandson of Clarence M. Bellin, the founder and president of Los Angeles Airways. This led to a series of civil suits, which, coupled with the subsequent union strike, forced the company to consider other options. But after failing to consummate a contract with the newest helicopter service, Golden West Airlines, Los Angeles Airways ceased operation in 1969. The helicopter to Disneyland resumed under Golden West Airlines in 1972. However, this only lasted for a 5-month period until it was over. The planned transportation center and Tri-City heliport for Anaheim was canceled, and the helicopter to Disneyland just flew away.
The helicopter alights at the adjacent Anaheim Disneyland heliport and discharges its eager passengers for a day of fun. The return flight carries local businessmen who will make jetliner connections at the airport.